The tablets do not begin with people, they begin with movement. Authority, they say, did not arise, was not negotiated, and was not seized. It descended. The phrase appears quietly, without elaboration, set into the opening lines of the earliest king lists as if it required no defense. Kingship descended from heaven, and only then did the sequence of rulers begin. The scribes who copied this formula did not pause to explain what heaven was, nor how descent occurred. They treated it as an established condition, a remembered transfer rather than an event needing description. In the Sumerian language, the word translated as heaven is an ith, names the sky, but it also names order, elevation, and authority beyond the city. In administrative contexts, and does not always describe a place one looks up toward. It can indicate legitimacy that originates elsewhere, outside the immediate community, prior to any local decision. When kingship is said to descend from An, the phrase may be less spatial than procedural. It implies that authority arrives already formed, not created by those who receive it. The Sumerian King List presents this descent as a starting condition. Before the first city is named, before the first ruler is listed, kingship is already complete. Only afterward does it settle into Eridu, then Bad Tabira, then Larok. The cities are recipients, not inventors. The list does not say that the people chose kings, nor that kings declared themselves. Authority moves independently, as if it were a transferable object, capable of relocation. This language aligns less with mythic drama and more with archival logic, where offices, titles, and jurisdictions are passed along intact. What is striking is how consistently this formulation is preserved across copies, separated by centuries. Scribal schools reproduced the phrase with care, even as city names and reign lengths varied. This suggests that the descent of kingship was not a metaphor open to reinterpretation, but a fixed concept anchored in institutional memory. The scribes inherited the phrase as part of the structure of history itself. To alter it would have been to misunderstand how rule was supposed to begin. In other tablets, particularly foundation inscriptions, rulers describe themselves not as originators of power, but as holders of it. They restore temples according to ancient plans, administer laws as they were established, and rule by the word of higher authority. The language places the king in a chain of custody. Power flows downward, through recognized channels, rather than outward, from individual action. The descent of kingship from heaven fits within this larger pattern of vertical transmission. Archaeological layers support this impression of continuity rather than invention. At sites like Eridu, early building phases show repeated reconstruction on the same footprint, with each new structure carefully aligned to the previous one. This suggests that builders were not improvising, but preserving a remembered layout. The temple was not simply rebuilt, it was reinstalled. If physical space was treated this way, it raises the possibility that authority was understood similarly, as something reoccupied rather than created. The concept of descent also appears in economic texts, though less overtly. Certain offices are described as having been placed in a city, rather than formed there. The verbs used imply assignment from an external source. In some cases, these offices persist even when the city declines, reappearing later under different rulers. This administrative persistence mirrors the way kingship moves in the King List, detached from any single population or dynasty. When later mythological compositions speak of divine assemblies assigning rule, they often echo the same procedural logic. Decisions are recorded, roles are distributed, boundaries are set. These narratives read less like stories of supernatural intervention and more like stylized accounts of authorization. The Anunnaki, when they appear in such contexts, are not described acting unpredictably. They convene, deliberate, and confirm. Their actions resemble governance more than creation. The phrase kingship descended from heaven may therefore function as a marker of legitimacy rather than cosmology. Heaven, in this sense, could designate a realm of recognized authority that stands above any single city or ruler. It is not necessarily distant, but it is removed from ordinary human contest. To say kingship descended from there is to say it was sanctioned by an order that pre-existed those who now administer it. Yet the tablets remain careful. They do not define this higher order explicitly, they do not locate it geographically, nor do they name its administrators in this opening formula. The descent is stated, not explained. This restraint suggests that the audience of the text already understood what was meant, or at least accepted the phrase as sufficient. The ambiguity may have been functional, allowing different generations to inherit the same structure without requiring precise agreement on its origin. If kingship was understood as something that could descend, then it could also, presumably, be withdrawn. The King List itself records moments when kingship is taken from one city and given to another. The process is described without moral commentary. Cities rise and fall, but kingship remains intact, moving on. This detachment implies that authority was not identical with any one ruler, nor even with any one place. Such a view reframes the role of early rulers. They were not founders in the modern sense. They were custodians of an office that arrived already shaped. Their task was to maintain alignment with a higher standard, not to redefine it. The descent from heaven established the terms. Human governance operated within them. If this is how authority was understood, then the question shifts. If kingship descended from an established order beyond the city, how is that order remembered, recorded, and named by the scribes who served it? And what kinds of beings or titles did they use when they needed to give that authority a face? Once authority is treated as something transferable, the question of who carries it becomes unavoidable. The tablets that attempt to answer this do not do so through stories, but through lists. In scribal archives, alongside inventories of wood, metals, and professions, there appear lexical tablets, cataloging names that later tradition would group under the label Anunnaki. These lists are not hymns, they are not prayers. They resemble administrative tools arranged in columns, ordered carefully, copied repeatedly. What is immediately noticeable is the structure of these names. Many are short, functional, and composed of familiar Sumerian elements. They do not unfold into narrative meaning, nor do they evoke natural forces or poetic imagery. Instead, they often combine titles, roles, or abstract qualities. Some include determinatives that mark status rather than divinity. In the context of lexical lists, these names behave like entries in a registry rather than characters in a myth. Lexical tablets were exercises in precision. Apprentice scribes copied them line by line to learn categories: trees, stones, animals, professions, cities. When names appear in this format, they are treated as data. The Anunnaki names in these lists are grouped, ordered, sometimes paired with explanations or alternative readings. This suggests that the scribes approached them as terms that needed to be mastered accurately, not as figures whose power lay in narrative embellishment. In contrast, when gods are praised in hymns, their names expand. They gather epithets, metaphors, genealogies. The language becomes fluid and associative. But the Anunnaki names in lexical contexts remain fixed. They resist poetic growth. Their consistency across tablets implies that variation was undesirable, perhaps even incorrect. This stability is characteristic of administrative nomenclature, where precision matters more than expression. Some names appear to encode function. Elements within them correspond to judgment, allocation, or oversight. Others resemble titles known from administrative texts, sharing roots with offices or duties recorded elsewhere. This overlap does not equate the Anunnaki with known officials, but it does suggest that the language used to describe them was drawn from the same conceptual pool as governance. The scribes did not invent a separate linguistic register for them. The placement of these names within tablets is also revealing. They are often situated near lists of deities, but not always among the most prominent. Sometimes they appear as a subset, sometimes as a parallel group. The ordering varies, but the format remains controlled. There is little sign of narrative hierarchy. Instead, there is categorization. The tablet seems concerned with completeness rather than reverence. This bureaucratic behavior of the names raises questions about how the Anunnaki were understood in practical terms. If their names needed to be memorized accurately, written correctly, and placed in the proper sequence, they likely had relevance beyond storytelling. Names in administrative cultures carry authority. They allow actions to be attributed, decisions to be validated, and records to be enforced. A name that must not change is a name that does work. Some scholars have noted that in certain legal or ritual texts, Anunnaki names appear without descriptive framing. They are invoked briefly, sometimes collectively, as if their role were already understood. There is no introduction, no explanation of who they are. This mirrors the way officers or councils are referenced in administrative documents. Their authority does not need justification within the text. It is assumed. The absence of genealogies is also notable. Many gods are carefully placed within family structures, their relationships mapped and retold. The Anunnaki, by contrast, are often presented as a group without internal lineage. They are counted, listed, assembled. This mode of presentation aligns more closely with councils or assemblies than with mythic families. It suggests function over narrative identity. Even the plurality of the term is telling. The word Anunnaki itself behaves grammatically like a collective designation. It groups individuals under a shared status. In administrative language, collectives often denote bodies with shared responsibility rather than shared origin. The tablets do not clarify whether this collectivity is symbolic or procedural. They simply use it. If the Anunnaki were imagined purely as distant gods, one might expect their names to accumulate stories over time. Instead, in many textual contexts, they remain static. Their presence is formal, almost restrained. They appear where order is being described, where decisions are being fixed, where authority needs to be referenced but not dramatized. This does not reduce them to human officials, nor does it elevate them beyond ambiguity. It places them in a textual role that is neither fully mythic nor fully mundane. They occupy the same written space as institutions, named, stable, invoked when necessary, but rarely explained. If these names functioned within the scribal world as markers of authority rather than characters of belief, then how were they activated in practice, through records, through law, through the allocation of resources, and what kinds of documents required their presence to carry weight? If names could be fixed without stories, then numbers could also be preserved without explanation. The Sumerian King List presents its figures with a similar restraint. It records reign lengths with precision, often extending into tens of thousands of years, and then moves on. There is no commentary, no justification, no indication that these numbers were meant to astonish. They are written in the same hand, with the same confidence, as far shorter reigns that follow. For the scribes, the figures themselves appear to have been the point. The problem of longevity emerges not because the tablets explain too much, but because they explain so little. The King List does not describe the bodies of its rulers, their health, or the circumstances of their deaths. It simply assigns them time. This time is measured using standard numerical systems, often employing sexagesimal notation consistent with other administrative records. The scribes did not invent a special counting method for the early kings. They used the same tools they used to measure grain, labor, and land. This numerical continuity suggests that the figures were not symbolic in a loose sense. They were computed. Large numbers in Sumerian texts usually result from accumulation rather than exaggeration. In accounting tablets, totals grow as entries are added. The possibility arises that the reign lengths in the early portion of the King List reflect a similar process, aggregating spans of rule that were later condensed into single names. Some copies of the King List complicate the matter further. Variants exist in which reign lengths differ, sometimes dramatically, while the sequence of kings remains the same. This indicates that the names were more stable than the numbers. If the list were purely mythic, one might expect the opposite. Instead, the variability suggests ongoing recalculation or reinterpretation, as if scribes were attempting to reconcile inherited figures with evolving conventions. The transition point at the flood is especially revealing. Before it, reigns are impossibly long. After it, they contract rapidly into spans that resemble historical plausibility. The text does not explain why. It does not say that bodies changed, or that time itself altered. It simply records the shift. This abrupt normalization resembles an administrative reform rather than a natural transformation, as though a new standard of record-keeping was applied in other Mesopotamian documents. Long spans of time are often associated with institutions rather than individuals. Temples are said to endure for thousands of years. Offices persist across generations. When such durations are attached to a single named figure, it may indicate that the name functions as a placeholder for a continuing authority. The king, in this sense, becomes the face of a regime rather than a person with a lifespan. This interpretation aligns with the way the King List treats succession. In many cases, the list moves smoothly from one ruler to the next without noting conflict, overlap, or quarrel. Time is cleanly divided, as if each segment belongs to a distinct administrative phase. The list does not concern itself with the machinae of human life. It is concerned with continuity. The mathematical structure of the early reigns also invites scrutiny. Certain numbers recur. Some reigns are exact multiples of others. These patterns resemble schematic totals rather than recorded biographies. In administrative archives, such schematization is common when summarizing long periods. Precision gives way to regularity. The goal is not to capture every detail, but to preserve the overall structure of time. If the early reign lengths encode dynastic memory, they may represent the duration of control exercised by a lineage, a city, or an office, later attributed to a single ancestral name. Over generations, as oral memory condensed and written records standardized, these collective spans could have been preserved as reigns. The king's name becomes a label for an era. The scribes who copied the King List were not unaware of the tension this created. In some versions, marginal notes or adjustments suggest discomfort with the scale of the numbers, yet the structure of the list remains intact. The decision to preserve these figures, even when they strained plausibility, indicates that they were inherited data. Altering them would have disrupted the continuity the list was meant to protect. The Anunnaki do not appear directly in the King List, but the logic of authority that governs the list echoes the same vertical transmission. Kingship descends, endures, and time adheres to power, not to flesh. The early rulers are not described as extraordinary beings. They are not said to live forever. They are simply assigned spans that exceed the human frame, without comment. This silence is important. It suggests that the scribes did not think in terms of lifespan when recording these reigns. They thought in terms of tenure. How long did kingship reside here, under this name, within this remembered structure? The answer was given numerically. Even if the units no longer corresponded to lived experience, as later generations encountered these figures, the meaning may have shifted. What was once a measure of institutional duration could be read as personal longevity. The text did not change, but the interpretive frame did. The King List thus preserves not only names and numbers, but the residue of an earlier way of organizing time. If the earliest reigns represent compressed histories rather than extended lives, then the list is less a chronicle of individuals and more an archive of remembered governance. And if that is the case, how might similar compressions appear elsewhere in the record hidden in legal formulas, temple accounts, or the quiet arithmetic of administration that follows? If time could be assigned without bodies, then sustenance could be recorded without devotion. In the temple archives, among tablets that track barley, oil, wool, and beer, there appear entries that name recipients marked with the divine determinative. These tablets do not sing, they calculate. They register quantities delivered on specific days, from specific storehouses, under the supervision of named officials. The format is uniform, the handwriting careful, the totals exact. Such tablets were not produced for ritual display. They were stored, referenced, and balanced against inventories. The scribes who compiled them were concerned with accountability. Each line follows a predictable structure: commodity, measure, recipient, occasion. When a figure labeled divine appears in this sequence, the grammar does not change. The same verbs of allocation are used as for human officials, craftsmen, and labor groups. The text does not pause to mark a transition from the sacred to the profane. In some cases, the quantities involved are modest, consistent with daily or monthly rations. In others, they are substantial, suggesting ongoing maintenance rather than episodic offering. Grain is issued repeatedly, not set. Beer is measured in standard units, not poured out. Oil is allocated with the same precision whether it goes to a named worker or to a figure bearing the sign of divinity. The tablets do not describe these transactions as sacrifices. They describe them as deliveries. The recipients themselves are sometimes grouped. A collective name appears, followed by a total amount. The structure resembles provisioning for an institution rather than homage to an unseen power. In administrative logic, rations sustain presence. They ensure that a person or office can continue to function. Offerings, by contrast, are often marked by exceptional language or by the absence of expectation. These ration tablets expect continuity. They assume return. Context reinforces this reading. Many of these tablets originate from temple complexes that also served as economic hubs. Temples owned land, employed workers, and managed surplus. The boundary between cult and administration was not sharply drawn. Within these spaces, food supported priests, guards, singers, and administrators alike. When a divine name appears in the ration lists, it enters this managed economy. Subject to the same rhythms of distribution, the language used for these divine recipients lacks the markers typical of ritual texts. There are no invocations, no praises, no acknowledgments of favor received. The tone is procedural. A delivery occurred. A quantity was issued. A balance was adjusted. The scribe's concern was not whether the recipient was pleased, but whether the numbers aligned. Some tablets specify occasions, festivals, inspections, or periods of service. On such days, rations increase. This pattern mirrors the provisioning of officials during extended duties. It suggests that certain figures, including those labeled divine, were associated with times of heightened activity within the temple complex. The rations support work, presence, or participation. Rather than appeasement, the determinative that marks divinity complicates interpretation but does not resolve it. In Sumerian writing, determinatives classify. They do not describe behavior. The sign indicates that the name belongs to a recognized category, but it does not dictate how that entity functions in every context. In ration tablets, the determinative sits quietly before the name, while the rest of the line proceeds as usual. The tablet does not instruct the reader to treat the entry differently. In some archives, the same divine names recur alongside consistent quantities over long periods. This regularity suggests planning. It implies expectation. The provisioning system anticipates need and meets it through scheduled delivery. Such patterns are difficult to reconcile with spontaneous acts of worship, which tend to be irregular and responsive. They align more closely with maintenance. This does not mean that ritual was absent. Other tablets clearly record offerings, feasts, and ceremonial distributions. Those texts are distinct. They often use different verbs, different formats, and different rhythms. The ration tablets stand apart. They belong to the daily machinery of the institution. When divine names appear there, they enter that machinery without disruption. The scribes who maintained these records were trained to separate categories. Their tablets reflect those distinctions. That they did not segregate divine recipients from administrative ones in these contexts suggests that, at least for the purpose of provisioning, the difference was not operational. The temple fed what needed feeding. The archive recorded what was given. If figures labeled divine were sustained through routine allocation, then their presence was expected within the institutional space. They were not distant recipients of smoke and prayer alone. They were accounted for, supplied, and integrated into the economy of the complex. The tablets do not tell us who consumed the rations, only that they were issued and recorded. This quiet administrative behavior shifts the question again. If sustenance flowed to named authorities through regular channels, then the structures that housed those channels become important. What kinds of spaces were designed to manage such provisioning, and how were they organized to coordinate authority, labor, and supply within the earliest temple complexes? Provisioning requires storage, and storage requires space arranged for oversight. At Eridu, the earliest architectural layers do not present themselves as monuments meant to impress from a distance. They appear instead as carefully managed interiors, rebuilt again and again on the same footprint, each phase preserving the orientation and proportions of what came before. This insistence on continuity suggests that the structure's function mattered more than its appearance. The builders were maintaining a system, not expressing an idea. The central building at Eridu, often described as a temple, occupies a raised platform that gradually grew through repeated reconstruction. Each new level respected the axis of the previous one. Walls were thick, rooms narrowly defined, and access controlled through limited entrances. Such features are not accidental. They regulate movement. They create zones of permission and restriction. In administrative architecture, this kind of spatial discipline allows authority to be exercised quietly, through layout rather than declaration. Within these complexes, archaeologists have identified storage rooms, work areas, and spaces that appear suited for record-keeping. Clay ceilings, fragments of tablets, and standardized containers suggest that goods moved through the building in traceable ways. The architecture supported accountability. Items entered, were stored, redistributed, and recorded. The building itself functioned as an instrument of coordination. Ritual activity did not exist separately from this process. The same structure that housed offerings also managed labor and surplus. The altar and the storeroom were not isolated domains. They were adjacent, sometimes interwoven. This proximity implies that ritual and governance were not competing functions, but complementary ones. Authority was reinforced through ceremony, while ceremony was sustained through administration. At Jaw. Later, but more extensively excavated, similar patterns appear. The temple precinct includes not only a central sanctuary but also surrounding rooms arranged in grids. These rooms vary in size but repeat in form, suggesting standardized use. Some contain benches or platforms, others large jars set into the floor. These features indicate controlled activities, meetings, storage, distribution. The complex reads less like a gathering place for spontaneous worship and more like a headquarters. The scale of these structures is also instructive. They are large enough to coordinate a city's resources, but not so vast as to serve purely symbolic purposes. Their growth corresponds with increases in population and economic complexity. As cities expanded, so did the need for centralized oversight. The temple complex met this need by concentrating decision-making, storage, and ritual authority in one location. Importantly, these buildings were not private residences. They were not palaces in the later sense, nor were they open communal spaces. Access was mediated. Movement within them would have been guided by status and role. Such spatial hierarchy mirrors administrative hierarchy. Those authorized to enter deeper zones likely held recognized positions within the system. Whether religious, economic, or political, the materials used reinforce this interpretation. Mudbrick construction required regular maintenance. Walls eroded and had to be rebuilt. Each rebuilding was an opportunity to alter the structure, yet the builders chose consistency. This choice implies adherence to a remembered plan, perhaps recorded or orally transmitted. The architecture preserved institutional memory in physical form. If authority was thought to descend from elsewhere, then the temple complex can be seen as the place where it was received and enacted. The building anchored abstract legitimacy into daily practice. Decisions made within its walls affected fields, laborers, and rations beyond them. The architecture thus bridged the intangible and the practical. In this light, the presence of figures labeled divine within the administrative records becomes less surprising. The complex was designed to host authority in multiple forms. Whether that authority was understood as human, divine, or something between, required space that could support its functions. The temple provided that space without sharply distinguishing between ritual act and administrative decision. The builders of Eridu and Ur did not leave written explanations of their intentions. They left plans embedded in brick and layout. These plans suggest that governance was exercised through control of flow, of people, of goods, of information. The sacred dimension did not replace this control. It legitimized it. If architecture served as a medium through which authority was stabilized and enacted, then the language used within these spaces becomes critical. How did scribes articulate commands, permissions, and statuses within the very buildings that embodied them? And what does the grammar of their records reveal about how authority was understood and maintained? Within the walls that organized movement and provision, words carried their own form of control. The tablets written in these spaces reveal a language calibrated not only for praise, but for instruction. Sumerian verb forms, especially those used in official inscriptions and administrative texts, operate with a precision that leaves little room for ambiguity. When these forms are applied to gods and kings alike, the overlap is not accidental. It reflects a shared grammar of authority. In Sumerian, verbs encode relationships. They mark who acts, who receives, and under what conditions an action is valid. In hymns, these verbs can elevate. In administrative records, they authorize. What is striking is that the same constructions often appear in both contexts without modification. A god establishes a city. A king establishes a boundary. The verb does not change its force. It performs the same function. It fixes an action as legitimate and lasting. Honorific prefixes further complicate the distinction. Certain verbal prefixes signal respect, elevation, or sanctioned power. These markers appear before the names of major deities, but they also appear before royal names in inscriptions and legal texts. The grammar does not reserve reverence exclusively for the divine. Instead, it applies reverential structure to any figure operating within the upper tier of authority. This linguistic practice suggests that the scribes did not maintain a rigid boundary between sacred and administrative language. Instead, they worked within a continuum. Authority, whether attributed to a god or a king, was articulated through the same verbal mechanisms. The difference lay not in grammar, but in context. A command issued by a king and a decree attributed to a god were framed in parallel ways, making both intelligible within the same system. Even prayers, when examined closely, often resemble petitions submitted to an official. They follow a structure: address, justification, request, expected outcome. The verbs used to ask for favor are similar to those used in administrative appeals. The speaker positions themselves as subordinate, the addressee as empowered to grant or deny. This shared structure implies that prayer and petition were linguistically adjacent acts. In legal texts, this overlap becomes especially clear. Oaths invoke gods using the same verbal forms that bind human witnesses. The verb that enforces the oath carries the same weight, regardless of whether the guarantor is divine or royal. The language does not shift into mythic mode. It remains procedural. The oath is valid because it is properly framed, not because of narrative embellishment. The Anunnaki, when referenced in such texts, are often associated with verbs of decision and confirmation. They decree, assign, or fix outcomes. These are not poetic actions. They are administrative ones. The verbs imply deliberation and finality. They place the Anunnaki within a linguistic role that mirrors councils or assemblies known from human governance. This does not mean that the scribes equated gods and kings. It means that they understood authority as something that could be expressed through a stable set of linguistic tools. Those tools were designed to manage hierarchy, obligation, and continuity. Once established, they were applied wherever authority needed to be articulated. The consistency of these forms across centuries suggests that they were learned early and transmitted carefully. Scribal education emphasized correct usage. A misplaced prefix or incorrect verb form could alter meaning significantly. The preservation of these structures indicates their importance in maintaining order, both textual and social. If language was a means of governance, Then its overlap with prayer reflects not confusion, but integration. The same society that administered fields and labor through tablets also articulated reverence through those tablets. The distinction between governing and praying was not encoded in grammar. It was negotiated through usage. This raises a subtle implication. If authority could be linguistically enacted through shared forms, then the power attributed to gods may have been experienced through the same verbal channels as power exercised by kings. The language made both legible, enforceable, and enduring. If words themselves carried authority through their structure, then the contexts in which they were spoken or written mattered deeply. Where, and under what conditions, were these authoritative words activated? And how were they made binding beyond the moment of their utterance? If authoritative language required proper framing to bind action, then law was the arena in which that framing became most consequential. Legal tablets from Sumerian archives are restrained documents. They do not narrate disputes in detail, nor do they moralize outcomes. They record claims, decisions, and guarantees. Within these records, the Anunnaki appear occasionally, not as actors in the dispute, but as those before whom words are fixed. Oath-taking formulas provide the clearest examples. In contracts concerning land, marriage, or debt, the parties swear by named authorities. Sometimes these are major gods, sometimes a city's tutelary deity, and sometimes the Anunnaki as a collective. The language is consistent. The oath is taken before them. The phrase does not suggest observation from a distance. It implies presence within a recognized juridical space. The legal function of a witness is not to intervene, but to guarantee. A witness does not resolve the dispute. They ensure that the resolution holds. In this role, the Anunnaki resemble an institutional authority more than an omniscient one. The tablets do not describe them knowing hidden truths or punishing falsehoods directly. Instead, their names anchor the agreement within an accepted framework of enforcement. The context of these oaths matters. They are often taken in specific locations, sometimes within temple precincts, sometimes before officials whose titles are recorded. The invocation of the Anunnaki accompanies these settings. The text does not separate the divine witness from the human process. It integrates them. The oath is valid because it is properly situated within the system. In some cases, the Anunnaki are listed alongside other witnesses without grammatical distinction. Human names, divine names, and institutional titles appear in sequence. The tablet does not elevate one category above the others linguistically. All serve the same function. They stand as guarantors of the statement made. This parity suggests that the role, rather than the nature of the witness, was what mattered. Legal consequences in these texts are deferred. The tablet records that an oath was taken, not what will happen if it is broken. The enforcement is assumed. The presence of the witness ensures that the agreement enters the archive of binding actions. The Anunnaki, in this sense, operate as custodians of record rather than as immediate enforcers. This reading aligns with the broader administrative culture. Authority was maintained through documentation, repetition, and shared acknowledgement. The law did not rely on dramatic punishment. It relied on memory and recognition. To swear before the Anunnaki was to place one's words within a remembered order that extended beyond the individuals involved. The collective nature of the Anunnaki is again significant. A group of witnesses implies stability. It reduces dependence on any single figure. In legal systems, institutions often replace individuals to ensure continuity. The Anunnaki, invoked as a group, fulfill this role. They represent an enduring authority that does not retire or die. Some tablets suggest that breaking an oath would result in divine displeasure. But this is rarely elaborated. The threat remains abstract. What is concrete is the record itself. The tablet survives. It can be consulted. It stands as evidence that an obligation was entered into under recognized authority. The Anunnaki's role is embedded in that permanence. If the Anunnaki functioned within legal texts as guarantors of order rather than supernatural observers, then their authority was exercised through the same mechanisms as human institutions: presence, acknowledgement, and record. The law did not require them to act visibly. It required them to be named. This raises a further question. If invoking the Anunnaki made agreements binding in law, then how did this authority extend beyond contracts and disputes into the regulation of time, labor, and the rhythms of communal life that law alone could not manage? If legal authority depended on witnesses who guaranteed continuity, then time itself required a similar form of oversight. The earliest astronomical tablets do not look outward in wonder. They look upward with discipline. Their concern is not revelation, but regulation. They track cycles, intervals, and repetitions, recording the movement of celestial bodies with the same procedural care used for rations and contracts. These tablets are spare. They list risings and settings, phases and intervals. The language is observational, not interpretive. Stars do not speak. Planets do not command. They appear, disappear, and return according to patterns that are noted and compared. The scribe's task is not to explain why the sky behaves as it does, but to remember how it behaves and when. In several early texts, celestial regularity is linked directly to the ordering of human activity. Months are named, festivals scheduled, obligations timed. The sky becomes a reference system. Its movements allow the city to coordinate labor, ritual, and administration across seasons. In this sense, astronomy functions as a tool of governance. It stabilizes time so that authority can act predictably within it. The Anunnaki enter these texts quietly. They are associated with the regulation of cosmic order rather than with spectacle. In some compositions, they are said to set or fix the destinies of stars. The verbs used are the same as those found in legal or administrative contexts. To set is to establish, to assign, to make binding. The language does not suggest that the Anunnaki create the stars, it suggests that they authorize their order. This distinction matters. Creation implies invention. Authorization implies recognition and maintenance. The tablets themselves reinforce the latter. The stars follow courses that can be measured and predicted. Their order is stable enough to support calendars that endure for generations. The Anunnaki's role, as described, aligns with custodianship of this order rather than its origin. Astronomical lists often appear alongside other lexical or technical texts. They are part of the same scribal curriculum. The apprentice learns the names of stars much as they learn the names of professions or tools. Accuracy is emphasized. Misnaming a star would disrupt calculation just as miscounting grain would disrupt allocation. The sky, in these texts, is an administrative domain. When omens are derived from celestial events, they follow established frameworks. A particular configuration corresponds to a known outcome. The relationship is not improvised. It is inherited. The tablet records what has been observed before and what followed. This is not prophecy in the ecstatic sense. It is precedent. The future is inferred from the past through pattern recognition. The Anunnaki, when invoked in these contexts, appear as guarantors of the pattern. They do not deliver messages. They uphold the reliability of the system. Their authority ensures that the sky remains a dependable reference. Without that reliability, calendars would fail, festivals would drift, and administrative coherence would weaken it. It is also notable that astronomical texts rarely ascribe the stars as distant realms or abodes. They are markers, signals, points of reference. The sky is flattened into a surface that can be mapped and measured. This practical orientation contrasts with later mythological elaborations. In the early tablets, the emphasis is on usability. Timekeeping is power. To control when actions occur is to shape collective life. By anchoring time to celestial cycles, the Sumerian system placed temporal authority beyond individual discretion. No ruler could alter the rising of a star. By aligning governance with the sky, authority gained an appearance of permanence and neutrality. If the Anunnaki were associated with this alignment, then their role was less about commanding events than about sustaining a framework within which events could be coordinated. They presided over order rather than intervening in it. The sky did not reveal new truths. It confirmed existing ones. If celestial records functioned as tools for administering time rather than accessing hidden knowledge, then other specialized bodies of knowledge may have served similar roles. How, then, was authority exercised over the body itself through diagnosis, treatment, and sanctioned knowledge that governed health as time governed labor? If time could be regulated through the sky, then the body required its own forms of order. The medical tablets of early Mesopotamia approach illness not as mystery, but as condition. They list symptoms, sequences, and outcomes with careful attention. Even when divine names appear, the structure of the text remains technical. The concern is not wonder, but procedure. Many of these tablets are organized. A condition is observed, its signs noted, its progression anticipated. The scribe records what is to be done and what may follow. This format mirrors administrative problem-solving. It classifies, predicts, and responds. The language is measured. There is little narrative and no speculation. The body becomes a system to be read. Divine figures enter these texts as sources of authority rather than agents of action. A treatment may be described as according to a named god, or an incantation may be attributed to a divine figure. Yet the steps of the treatment are explicit. Ingredients are listed, dosages implied, applications described. The text does not wait for intervention. It proceeds. Incantations, often assumed to be purely ritual, reveal a similar pattern. They are standardized, repeated, and embedded within treatment sequences. Their wording is fixed. This suggests that they were considered effective because they were correct, not because they were spontaneous. In bureaucratic cultures, correctness is power. The incantation functions as an authorized component of the procedure. Some tablets distinguish between the role of the healer and the source of the knowledge. The healer applies the treatment. The god knows it. This separation implies transmission rather than action. Knowledge descends from an established authority and is enacted by trained practitioners. The god does not heal directly. The healer does. Using sanctioned methods, the repetition of these texts across different archives suggests institutional oversight. Medical knowledge was not private. It was preserved, copied, and taught. Errors would have consequences. The presence of divine attribution may have served to stabilize the tradition, discouraging alteration. To change the text would be to depart from authorized knowledge. The Anunnaki appear, occasionally, in broader medical or incantatory contexts, often associated with the setting of conditions or destinies. Their involvement is indirect. They establish the framework within which illness occurs and recovery is possible. The text does not depict them adjusting symptoms or responding to pleas. They define the boundaries of the system. This aligns with the administrative character of other domains. Authority does not intervene constantly. It sets parameters. Within those parameters, trained agents operate. In medicine, the healer works within a body of knowledge that is treated as inherited and sanctioned. The divine name marks that inheritance. The medical tablets also reflect an understanding of responsibility. Failure is anticipated. Some texts note when a patient will not recover. This admission suggests realism rather than magical optimism. The authority of the knowledge does not guarantee success. It guarantees that the correct procedure was followed. Such realism reinforces the idea that divine attribution functioned as validation, not as explanation. The cause of illness may be unknown, but the response is regulated. The healer is accountable to the text, not to divine whim. The god's name secures the legitimacy of the practice. If medicine was governed by authorized knowledge rather than expectation of intervention, then the body was managed, much like land or labor, through inherited systems of control. Authority permeated care without replacing it. If this pattern holds, then the same approach may apply to broader narratives that explain origins and disasters. How were collective memories of catastrophe framed as divine acts, or as events remembered and regulated through institutional storytelling? If the body could be regulated through inherited procedure, then collective memory required its own form of discipline. The pre-flood narratives preserved in Sumerian texts are often approached as stories of origin. But within the archives, they behave more like structured records. They establish sequences, assign durations, and define transitions. Their concern is not spectacle, but order. The antediluvian section of the King List is the most explicit example. It does not describe the deeds of its rulers, nor their personalities. It lists names, cities, and reign lengths, then marks a boundary, the flood. Everything before this boundary is organized according to one temporal logic. Everything after follows another. The list does not explain the flood. It uses it as a divider, a point at which administration must be recalibrated. This use of catastrophe as a structural marker suggests that the connotative functions as an administrative memory. It separates eras in the same way that later documents separate dynasties or reforms. The flood is not elaborated upon because its role is not explanatory. It is organizational. It allows the record to acknowledge rupture without losing continuity in other texts. Pre-flood rulers are associated with the establishment of institutions. Cities are founded, offices defined, practices set in place. These attributions are brief and formulaic. They do not describe innovation in detail. They state that something was established and move on. This economy of language mirrors foundation inscriptions from later periods, where kings record restorations rather than inventions. The antediluvian rulers themselves are distant figures. They are not praised, blamed, or dramatized. They serve as anchors for time and authority. Their extreme reign lengths, rather than emphasizing their difference, may emphasize the endurance of the systems attributed to them. The name becomes shorthand for a remembered regime. Flood layers in the archaeological record reinforce this reading. At several Mesopotamian sites, distinct sediment layers indicate periods of disruption. Above these layers, rebuilding occurs. The new structures often replicate earlier layouts. This pattern suggests that memory-guided reconstruction. The flood did not erase knowledge. It tested its preservation. Texts describing the flood echo this emphasis. Survival is attributed not to chance, but to foreknowledge and instruction. The focus is on what is carried through the disaster: measurements, plans, living beings, and tools. The narrative preserves a concern for continuity. What matters is not the destruction itself, but what endures beyond it. In this context, the pre-flood era functions as a reference point. It represents a remembered order that later generations sought to restore. The authority of that order derives from its antiquity. By situating foundational practices before the flood, the texts place them beyond dispute. They become part of the inherited structure of the world. The Anunnaki appear in these narratives as figures associated with decision-making and delimitation. They convene, they agree, they set boundaries. Their actions resemble those of an overseeing body rather than creators of chaos. Even the flood, when attributed to divine decision, is framed as a response to imbalance rather than arbitrary destruction. This framing aligns with the administrative mindset evident elsewhere. When a system fails, it is corrected. The correction may be severe, but it is purposeful. The flood resets conditions so that order can be re-established. The texts do not linger on suffering. They move quickly to preservation and renewal. The preservation of pre-flood memory through lists and narratives suggests that these texts served as guides. They reminded later rulers of an earlier configuration of authority. By aligning themselves with antediluvian figures, post-flood kings could claim continuity with a sanctioned past. The memory of pre-flood regimes thus becomes a resource. This approach to memory avoids nostalgia. The texts do not idealize the pre-flood world. They do not suggest it was perfect. They treat it as a baseline, a known arrangement that could be referenced when rebuilding. Memory here is functional. It supports governance by providing precedent. If the antediluvian rulers represent remembered regimes rather than literal beings, then the flood marks a transition in how authority is managed and recorded. The question that follows is not what was lost, but how power was reinstalled afterward, and what changes were introduced when kingship returned to the cities that survived. What follows a disruption is rarely invention. In the post-flood sections of Sumerian texts, the emphasis is not on creating a new world, but on resuming one that had been interrupted. Kingship does not reappear spontaneously. It is said to return. The language is deliberate. Authority is reinstalled, not discovered. The King List resumes with a familiar formula. After the flood had swept over, kingship descended again from heaven. The phrase mirrors the opening of the pre-flood section. There is no suggestion that the nature of kingship has changed. The same authority that once moved among cities now does so again. The flood marks a pause, not a transformation of principle. Post-flood rulers are described with shorter reigns, but their functions remain consistent. They govern cities, oversee temples, and maintain order. The reduction in reign length may reflect changes in record-keeping or political organization, but the structure of authority persists. The text does not frame these rulers as pioneers in a new age. It presents them as successors. Rebuilding narratives reinforce this continuity. When cities are restored, the texts emphasize adherence to ancient plans. Temples are rebuilt as before. Walls are raised on existing foundations. This insistence on replication suggests that the goal was alignment with an established order. Innovation is not celebrated. Correctness is. In flood narratives that include survival figures, instruction is central. The survivor is told what to build, how to measure, what to preserve. These instructions are precise. They resemble technical directives rather than mythic riddles. The knowledge that guides survival is not improvised. It is transmitted. The Anunnaki appear in these moments as arbiters of restoration. They determine when the flood ends, when life resumes, and how authority is redistributed. Their role is procedural. They do not remake the cosmos, they regulate the transition. This portrayal aligns with their function in legal and administrative texts. Post-flood governance also reflects a concern with re-establishing boundaries. Land is allocated, offices reassigned, cults reinstated. The texts record these acts with the same formulaic language used in later administrative inscriptions. The flood does not disrupt the grammar of authority. It tests its resilience. Archaeological evidence parallels this textual pattern. At sites where flood deposits are present, subsequent rebuilding often follows previous layouts. Streets reappear along similar lines. Public buildings occupy familiar positions. This suggests that memory-guided reconstruction. The city remembered itself. The concept of kingship descending again implies that authority was never destroyed. It was suspended. This suspension allows the text to account for catastrophe without abandoning continuity. The flood becomes an event within history, not the end of history. Authority remains external, waiting to be reactivated. This approach to catastrophe reflects a broader administrative mindset. Systems may fail, but they are not discarded. They are repaired. The flood narrative provides a framework for understanding disruption without undermining legitimacy. It explains why power can resume without needing to justify itself anew. If post-flood texts emphasize restoration over reinvention, then they position civilization as an inheritance. Each generation receives structures shaped long before them. The role of the ruler is to maintain alignment with that inheritance. This raises a final tension. If authority is inherited and repeatedly restored, then myth itself may function less as explanation and more as archive. How, then, do creation narratives and divine assemblies operate within this system of remembered governance? If authority survived catastrophe through restoration, then the stories that describe its origins may serve a similar function. Sumerian myths, when read alongside administrative and legal texts, often appear less concerned with explaining the world than with organizing memory. Their structure is economical. Events unfold quickly. Decisions are recorded without justification. Outcomes are fixed and carried forward. This restraint suggests that myth operated as a form of archive. Creation narratives begin not with chaos, but with arrangement. Elements are separated, roles assigned, domains established. The language used mirrors that of administrative division. Land is measured, responsibilities distributed, boundaries defined. The gods involved do not debate meaning. They determine function. The narrative moves forward as if following a procedural outline. Descent myths. in which authority or knowledge moves from one realm to another, follows similar patterns. A transfer occurs, conditions are set, consequences follow. The text does not dwell on emotion or transformation, it records the movement and its effects. This economy of description aligns with record-keeping rather than allegory. The Anunnaki, when they appear in these myths, often function as a collective body that ratifies decisions. They assemble, they agree, they confirm. Their role resembles that of a council whose deliberations are summarized rather than transcribed. The myth preserves the outcome, not the process. This is characteristic of bureaucratic records, where decisions are noted without recounting debate. Mythic time is also revealing. Events are placed in sequence, but durations are often unspecified or exaggerated. This abstraction allows the narrative to compress long developments into manageable form. In administrative practice, summaries replace detail when preserving memory over generations. Myth may perform a similar compression, preserving the structure of events while allowing specifics to fade. The repetition of certain narrative motifs across texts supports this view. Creation, descent, disruption, and restoration recur with minor variation. Each iteration reinforces the same organizational principles. The world is ordered, authority is assigned, imbalance occurs, order is re-established. This cycle mirrors the rhythms of governance, rather than the unpredictability of lived experience. Importantly, these myths were copied in scribal contexts. They appear on tablets alongside lexical lists and legal formulas. Their preservation depended on the same institutions that maintained administrative records. This shared transmission suggests that myths were valued for their utility in maintaining a coherent worldview. Aligned with governance, the language of myth often employs the same verbs used in legal and administrative texts: to decree, to establish, to assign. These verbs carry weight because they are familiar. They link the mythic past to the administrative present. The actions of gods become legible through the same grammar that records human authority. This does not mean that myth was devoid of symbolic meaning. It means that its primary function may not have been interpretation. It preserved a framework. By recounting how order was first established, myth reinforced the legitimacy of existing structures. It reminded listeners that authority had always been organized in this way. If myth served as archive, then its endurance makes sense. It was not preserved because it entertained, but because it stabilized. It offered a condensed memory of how things came to be arranged and why they should remain so. This perspective reframes the relationship between myth and administration. Rather than standing apart, they support each other. Myth provides deep memory. Administration provides daily practice. Both rely on continuity. If myths preserved bureaucratic realities in narrative form, then similar patterns may appear beyond Sumer. How do other early civilizations encode authority and memory? And do they reveal parallel strategies for preserving governance across time and collapse? Linguistic evolution also plays a role. As Akkadian gradually replaced Sumerian in many official contexts, older terms lost currency. Concepts encoded in Sumerian did not always translate cleanly. Some were simplified, others reinterpreted. The Anunnaki, whose significance was embedded in specific linguistic structures, may have faded as those structures dissolved. Archival practices contribute further to the picture. Not all tablets were copied indefinitely. Scribal curricula changed. Texts deemed essential were preserved. Others were allowed to lapse. The survival of a term depended on its utility within the current system. If the Anunnaki no longer served a clear administrative or legal function, their names would naturally appear less often. This decline does not suggest that the authority they represented vanished. Instead, it may have been redistributed. Functions once associated with the Anunnaki appear in later texts under different names or institutions. Councils, gods, or royal officers assume similar roles. The system persists, even as its labels shift. Archaeological evidence mirrors this textual trend. Later temple complexes emphasize singular deities with elaborate iconography. Administrative records focus more on royal authority. The collective, procedural imagery gives way to more personalized representations of power. This change reflects evolving political needs, rather than a sudden theological shift. The quietness of the disappearance is telling. There is no polemic against the Anunnaki, no declaration of obsolescence. They simply become unnecessary. In administrative cultures, what is no longer needed is not denounced. It is omitted. Silence becomes a form of change. This process highlights the fragility of memory-based authority. When the structures that sustain memory alter, the figures associated with them can fade without leaving a trace of conflict. The Anunnaki's disappearance may thus reflect a reconfiguration of governance. Rather than a collapse of belief, if named authorities can vanish through gradual shifts in language, politics, and archival practice, then the final question is not why they disappeared, but what remains when such systems erode. How does a civilization remember itself when the frameworks that once preserved its authority begin to fail? By the time the named authorities fade from the record, what remains is not emptiness but structure. Cities continue to function, laws are enforced, calendars observed, fields measured. The system endures even as the language that once framed its origins grows quieter. This persistence brings the central question back into focus, not as a problem to be solved, but as a tension to be held. Did Sumerian civilization understand itself as something invented, or something received? The earliest texts rarely describe beginnings in terms of experimentation. Tools, offices, rituals, and laws appear fully formed. When origins are mentioned, they are placed beyond reach, either before the flood or within the actions of distant authorities. The language resists novelty. Even when change occurs, it is framed as restoration. A canal is reopened, not dug for the first time. A temple is rebuilt, not designed anew. Kings present themselves as caretakers of arrangements already known. Administrative records reinforce this orientation. The tablets assume shared standards. Measures of weight and volume are consistent across regions and generations. Numerical systems remain stable. Scribal training emphasizes replication rather than innovation. A student learns to copy, not to compose. Correctness is defined by alignment with precedent. This approach suggests a culture that valued continuity over creativity, at least in its official expressions. The King List embodies this mindset. It does not celebrate founders. It catalogues succession. Its concern is not how kingship emerged, but how it moved. Even the flood, the most dramatic rupture in the record, serves to reinforce continuity by dividing time into manageable segments. Authority pauses and resumes. It does not reinvent itself. Invention, when it appears, is understated. New cities are established, but they inherit kingship rather than generate it. New rulers ascend, but they do so by receiving authority, not by claiming originality. The language consistently points backward. Legitimacy derives from alignment with what came before, whether that past is remembered clearly or only gestured toward. This backward orientation does not imply stagnation. Sumerian society changed. Technologies improved, writing expanded, political structures evolved. But these developments are rarely framed as breakthroughs. They are absorbed into the existing order, presented as refinements rather than departures. The system adapts while preserving the appearance of continuity. The role of the Anunnaki within this framework remains deliberately ambiguous. They are never credited with inventing civilization outright. Instead, they authorize, assign, and confirm. Their presence supports the idea of inheritance without specifying its origin. They stand at the threshold between human administration and remembered authority, allowing the system to claim antiquity without detailing its beginnings. This ambiguity may have been functional. To assert invention is to invite challenge. To claim inheritance is to defer authority beyond dispute. By presenting civilization as received, Sumerian texts protect it from critique. If the system predates its current holders, then those holders are responsible only for maintaining it, not justifying it. Yet the absence of explicit invention narratives does not mean that innovation was unrecognized. It may simply have been framed differently. Change could be described as rediscovery, correction, or fulfillment of earlier designs. The language allows progress without rupture, growth without origin stories. The archaeological record complicates this picture. Early urbanization in southern Mesopotamia required coordination, planning, and adaptation to new conditions. Such developments do not occur without human initiative. The cities had to be built, the canals dug, the fields organized. These acts required decision-making and experimentation. Yet the texts that survive rarely foreground these moments. They subsume them under the language of continuity. This discrepancy between material evidence and textual presentation suggests a deliberate narrative choice. The people who recorded their world chose to emphasize inheritance. Whether this reflects belief, ideology, or administrative convenience remains uncertain. The tablets do not explain why this choice was made. They simply enact it. The question, then, is not whether Sumerian civilization was invented or inherited in an absolute sense. It is how the civilization chose to remember itself. Memory shapes legitimacy. By framing their world as the continuation of an older order, Sumerian scribes anchored authority in time rather than in individuals. This framing has consequences. It allows authority to survive, collapse, transition, and loss. When names disappear, structures remain. When languages shift, procedures persist. Civilization becomes something that can be restored, not reinvented. Its power lies in its endurance. If Sumer understood itself through inheritance rather than invention, then its final records take on new weight. As the system weakened and memory thinned, what fragments were preserved and what silences emerged as authority itself began to fade. By the end of the record, what stands out most clearly is not what is stated, but what is left unsaid. The tablets that survive are numerous, precise, and often repetitive. Yet they avoid certain explanations with remarkable consistency. They do not tell us why authority took the form it did. They do not explain who first decided how kingship should move, how law should bind, or how order should be restored after collapse. These absences are not accidental gaps. They appear structured, preserved across genres and centuries. Sumerian texts are rarely reflective in the modern sense. They do not pause to theorize their own systems. A law tablet does not explain why law exists. An administrative list does not justify the measures it uses. A king does not describe how kingship was conceived. The tablets assume these things as given. This assumption itself becomes a form of evidence. It suggests that certain foundations were treated as beyond inquiry. Even creation narratives avoid origins in a strict sense. They arrange rather than explain. They establish relations without recounting how those relations were first imagined. The language moves quickly past beginnings and settles into order. What came before that order remains undefined. Silence marks the boundary of acceptable memory. The Anunnaki exemplify this pattern. They are present where authority must be invoked, but absent where explanation would be expected. They authorize decisions, witness oaths, and set conditions. Yet their own origins, composition, and limits are rarely described. The texts do not ask who governs the governors. This omission is consistent. It suggests that the system did not require such clarification to function. In administrative culture, what is not written can be as important as what is. Writing fixes obligations, quantities, and names. It stabilizes systems. Questions that might destabilize those systems are often excluded. The tablet's silence on foundational origins may reflect an intentional boundary, a recognition that authority depends on acceptance rather than analysis. Archaeology reinforces this impression. The earliest urban layers do not include experimental forms abandoned shortly thereafter. Instead, they show rapid standardization. Measurements converge. Layouts repeat. Practices spread. This suggests that by the time writing begins to document the system, many of its assumptions are already settled. The formative debates, if they occurred, are archaeologically invisible. The flood narratives illustrate how silence operates alongside memory. The texts acknowledge catastrophe without detailing its mechanics. They preserve the fact of disruption, but not its cause in practical terms. The flood becomes a marker, not a subject of inquiry. What matters is not why it happened, but how order resumed afterward. The silence around causation protects the continuity of authority. Legal texts behave similarly. They record agreements without exploring motive. They do not ask why one party trusted another, only that an oath was taken. The enforcement of law relies on recognition, not introspection. To question the basis of authority within the legal document would weaken its force. Silence preserves function. Even when the record becomes more verbose in later periods, explanation remains limited. Gods acquire more elaborate stories, kings more detailed inscriptions, yet the underlying assumptions remain untouched. Authority is still something received, maintained, and restored. The language grows, but the foundation stays implicit. These silences challenge modern expectations. We look for origins, causes, and definitions. The Sumerian record offers procedures, sequences, and acknowledgements instead. It treats uncertainty not as a problem to solve, but as a condition to manage. By not naming certain things, the system allows them to remain stable. This approach complicates interpretation. It prevents definitive conclusions about whether the Anunnaki were understood as gods, rulers, or something else entirely. The tablets do not resolve this question because they do not frame it. They operate as if the distinction were unnecessary. Authority functions regardless of how it is, conceptualized. In this sense, uncertainty becomes historical evidence. The absence of clarification suggests that the people who wrote and used these texts were more concerned with continuity than with explanation. They preserved what was needed to keep the system operating. What lay beyond that need was allowed to fade. The survival of the tablets themselves underscores this point. What we possess is a fraction of what once existed, selected by chance, preservation, and later copying practices. The silences we observe are layered, some original, some accidental. Yet their persistence across the record implies that even when material was lost, the boundaries of what could be said remained intact. The investigation thus ends not with an answer, but with a recognition of limits. The Sumerian record offers a civilization that understood itself through maintenance rather than origin stories, through authority, inherited rather than invented, through memory stabilized by silence. The Anunnaki remained within that silence, neither fully revealed nor dismissed. What remains, then, is a final question shaped by the record itself. If the most enduring form of authority is the one that does not need to explain its beginnings, what does that suggest about how the earliest civilizations understood power, memory, and the necessity of not saying everything at all?